We'll also have, oh, sorry. And then Dr. Meghna as well. So it's wonderful, wonderful to have everyone here. Bear with me one moment. I'm going to share screen and we have a presentation to share. Okay, are you all seeing the share screen now? All right. This picture is of buckrow. If you're not familiar with buckrow, it's in Virginia. And hello, baby Robinson. Sorry, I get see beautiful baby on board. Anyway, this picture's in Buckrow, and it's in Virginia, and that is near Point Comfort, which is also the former Fort Monroe. Point Comfort Lighthouse is where the first slaves landed in Virginia in 1619. In recent years, I've gotten a little bit sensitive to folks who have claimed that CRT is not real. Right? So we're going to look at critical race theory a bit today. And the reason I get a little bit sensitive is because I'm from Hampton. I grew up swimming in those waters. I know my history genetically, geographically, and by record. And whether you agree or disagree ideologically with the stance of critical race theory, you cannot erase history and facts, and I can present you those facts, right? So just a little bit of that piece there. One of the biggest problems, and earlier this morning, it was great to hear the president speak, president of Hamline University speak. I should correct myself there. She provided the environmental, almost an external environmental analysis of what's going on in higher education. And in higher education, we've seen a great deal of just a rise in hateful rhetoric, beyond the country, permeating into our institutions. And now, this is from a recent, 2 years ago, study now, 44% of Americans agreeing that racial, religious, and ethnic diversity is a threat. Others agree that groups have to be kept in their place, really? And then 15 disagree that the majority are a threat to the interest of the country. Just bear with me 1 second here. Micro and macro aggressions. If you joined us during COMPA, we're also doing work. We spread out in a variety of different divisions here, right? But we're also doing work from that perspective. And this Dr. Courtney Jones-Carney was presenting at the individual level of microaggressions and organizational level. Oh, excuse me, my fingers are crazy. But when you think about aggression, you can think about it from both the societal, institutional, organizational, and individual level. And so much research can be generated from each of those areas alone. This is the emancipation tree. It's over 500 years old at Hampton University. If you ever get an opportunity to visit the emancipation tree, I encourage you to do so because education has a very deep history in Hampton, right? And here also Mary Peak taught under this tree. And it's a beautiful, storied and rich history. Knowledge is under attack. And again, the president, she emphasized that earlier today. Our democratic societies build in protections for faculty that are not at the whims at either party in power, right? I'm not going to present on academic freedom, but that is important. We also include in here, those of you who know Rikuchi, I don't know if you see the bottom here, but Rikuchi, everyone, I love her research in the area of human resources, but also this is from her research methods, right? And looking at epistemological comparisons and framing CRT as a legitimate form and frame. So I'll turn it over now to Ms. Cooper. And first I'll have her introduce herself and take over from there. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tylis Cooper, and I am a doctoral candidate at this stage at the University of Baltimore. Much of my work or research has been around the intersectionality of race as a social construct, power, and particularly policy. So I've done some research here on critical race theory, grounding the definition and understanding. So as many of us have turned on our news or even plugged into our social media outlets, we've heard, I'm sure, a variety of meanings and understandings and snapshots of critical race theory. Critical race theory is attributed to, and one of the founding scholars and incredible, beautiful minds would be Derek Bell, right? And so Derek Bell is attributed to some of the key components and concepts of critical race theory. And we are particular about grounding our conversation here about what are working definitions and understandings, because we recognize that so much of critical race theory has been demonized and misunderstood, leaving folks with a misunderstanding of what critical race theory is. So here are three key components. Racism is ordinary. It is not aboriginal in any sort of way. Whiteness is placed on a racial hierarchy for both psychological and material purposes. And race, this is probably one of the more key and coined phrases as we talk about critical race theory, that race is a social construct, and the social construction is a product of social thoughts and relationships here. And there are other working definitions, but these are really key as we move forward and we talk about how critical race theory and how race and racism itself impacts many and most all of the institutions that we interact with, particularly people of color, particularly historically marginalized groups, right? So what's all this controversy about? It's a cognitive context, right? So critical race theory was originally reserved for the ivory towers of legal scholars to debate over, right? It was a continuation of what was thought to be a stalled or a, how do I say this? A less than actualized civil rights movement, right? After the civil rights movement, people were looking in the 1960s and 70s for a shift, a significant shift in the quality of life for those Black Americans who had been living under years and decades of oppression. And that had all but stalled, and in many ways had been reversed. And so critical race theory was looking to be an extension of that. So this cognitive idea of how we embrace or reject it is really a defensive stance, right? So folks that, as Dr. Heather started off by saying, that want to debate history, it really does come down to, in many ways, is cognitive dissonance, this desire to just divorce yourself from historical facts and events. The hateful rhetoric is not new. It's absolutely has been used as political currency. And in the past, it's been pretty effective in many ways. We've seen it in many presidential races. This is not unique. Much of this dog whistling politics and such has been recycled. So it's not new, but it was intentional. Part of that administration was intending to freeze the brand, was the idea out there, freeze the brand and discredit, particularly at some point eliminating diversity training, which was once mandated, but now eliminated and prohibited. It just, as a backlash, we had things like, a commission, entire, I think it's 1778, I intentionally didn't retain it, commission, right? The dismantling and banding of diversity training, but all as a backlash, particularly to the 1619 project, which is a fantastic project. And what we also saw, and we currently see, and we'll probably see more of at different state levels, whether it's Texas and Florida and Colorado, we've seen reactions to what would be a surge or the insertion of critical race theory, whether it's at the higher education level or the K through 12 level. And it's always an ebb and flow. So it's always a reaction. The implementation or the implementation of Juneteenth as a national holiday came right before it was decided it was going to be banned in Texas for CRT. So it becomes a response. But more importantly, let me say this, it becomes a reaction. and not a response. So the reaction is just to stoke. So it has been moved away from a theoretical framework to really make individuals understand how institutions have absolutely used racism to marginalize groups over centuries, to just demonize and to discredit it in any way possible, and banning it in many ways, not even to be discussed, again, in our K through 12, even in our higher education areas there. You can advance, Dr. Heather. Yes, and so my colleague here from University of Baltimore is going to now unpack a particular area, as we have looked at perhaps education as one area and even law. My colleague is going to unpack what that looks like at our healthcare level, and what it looks like real time for real people. Sydne is up next.
Thank you, Tylis. My name is Sydne Robinson. I am a first year public administration student, and my concentration is in health administration and policy. I'm actually working with Maryland's Prescription Drug Affordability Board, investigating prescription affordability issues for some of our marginalized communities. So this is something that's really near and dear to my heart. So in February of last year, the 117th Congress proposed the Anti-Racism in Public Health Act of 2021. This gave definition to structural racism and would establish a dedicated administration known as the National Center on Anti-Racism in Health. They would be able to declare that racism is a historical and present public health crisis and threatens the physical and mental well-being nationally and globally. Within this bill, they did give some health disparities that are commonly known, but I'll just share what I found interesting from what they shared. People of color comprise a disproportionate percentage of persons with disabilities in the US. Medicaid spends less money on aging adults of colors receiving home and community-based services and are more likely to be hospitalized. Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes when compared to white women. And aging adults are more likely to be admitted to nursing homes and assisted living facilities that are of poorer quality. So as you can see, even the government has been able to identify where some of these health disparities exist and really was trying to be proactive about addressing them. You can advance the slide. So my piece today is the intersection between critical race theory, policy, and medicine. When you speak about medicine, there is like 2 institutions. You have the education piece and the piece that is definitely regarding practice. So I just found some different terms that are used in the healthcare field that I found really alarming. So there's a practice of biological essentialism, which is a process in which biological influences precede cultural influences and set predetermined limits to the effects of culture. So in the Black community, you'll hear people commonly say that sickle cell anemia is a Black disease or prostate cancer is a Black disease. While there may be genetic markers that predispose people for these types of chronic illnesses, it definitely downplays the geography that people are coming in contact with and other environmental factors that may also be impacting these communities as a whole and not just racialized healthcare. Additionally, there is a big underrepresentation of people of color in medical fields. If you did not know, the American Medical Association was officially desegregated in 1968. So that was only 54 years ago. So you can imagine how far behind communities of color are behind in addressing disparities that exist in their communities because they're just now being brought to the table. You can advance the next slide. So this slide is from the Kennedy Family Foundation. I found this to be super helpful when discussing health disparities and really deconstructing them. Health disparities are really motivated by social and economic inequalities, and racism and discrimination only impede upon these inequalities that already exist. But this is definitely nothing new to any of us. If you are aware, there are many pieces of literature and books that have been published that outline the turbulent and chaotic relationship that Black people have had with the healthcare industry. For example, medical apartheid speaks about the Kennedy-Krieger experiment that existed during the early 1990s, where people in Baltimore County or Baltimore City were exposed to lead paint. However, when we speak about violence in Baltimore City, we do not acknowledge the role that Kennedy-Krieger has played in perpetuating violence within the city. We've heard of Henrietta Lacks, who was taken advantage of for her screening and who really is essentially the mother of medicine, but her family was not accurately compensated for her contributions. There is a doctor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County by the name of Dr. Don Beeler, who wrote a book called Pests in the City: Flies, Bedbugs, Cockroaches, and Rats. And in this piece, she discusses the impact of racial and economic injustices in urban communities. Health authorities often treat pest infestation as an isolated and private apolitical problem. And this definitely disregards the political problem associated with ecology. So in short, just because you're building all of these new housing complexes to house marginalized communities, there's also a disregard for the organisms that naturally exist in those spaces. So when you talk about rats and rodents, it's kind of seen as an issue of, poor communities, but you're not looking at the piece where the government or the state is responsible for rehoming these organisms. Instead of doing that, it creates bigger issues, and it really does impact the way health disparities are driven in these communities, as you see chronic illnesses like asthma and things like that. Additionally, Black people tend to be a part of the uninsured population when it comes to gaining healthcare access, so not have the financial stability to even utilize these avenues for their health.
Well, I'm going to stop us there and hold questions and allow the next presenters. So bear with me, I'm going to stop share here. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. And forgive me, do you all have your slide sharing capability? Have I granted that to you?
I believe. Is it for Seongdeok and I? We're next, right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yes, I believe we have. So let me just pull that up.
Okay. Just let me know if you run into any issues on that one. So next in line, we have yes, thank you. The Invisible Group: Historic Analysis of Racism. This is beautiful. Dr. Sabharwal, Aurora Becerra, and Seongdeok. Oh, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Aurora Becerra, and I am a Master's of Public Affairs student at the University of Texas at Dallas. I'm in about my first year and a half. And I am a co-author of this paper titled The Invisible Group: A Historical Analysis of Racism Experienced by Asian Americans in the United States. So let me just move on to the next screen. So in this presentation, this paper is specifically highlighting the patterns of violence and ostracization that have happened throughout time, beginning in the 1800s to present day. There are reoccurring themes of discrimination, especially as it relates to labor and disease as a means to oppress Asian Americans over time. Specifically, what we see in this analysis is a contradiction between the ideas of Asian Americans as the model minority, but also treated as this forever foreigner, all through the lens of the othering hypothesis, which is when a dominant group marginalizes a non-dominant group. And my colleague Seongdeok will kind of expand on that later on as well. The nexus of how this paper really started was In the spring of 2021, there was a call for more research on the increasing violence occurring in the AAPI community during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think we can all remember when there was this uptick in not only violence, but uptick in negative blame rhetoric occurring specifically from our politicians against Asian Americans, using them as a scapegoat for the start and spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. Such rhetoric included the Kung flu, Wuhan virus, China virus, which were all unfortunately very, very public and in the mainstream media at that time. Then in March of 2021, we see this kind of culminate in a violent act in Atlanta, the Atlanta massage parlor shooting, where we had this individual go into two different massage parlors and kill the women that were in there and kind of have this act of violence. Due to the uptick in violence that was occurring, the Biden administration was under a lot of pressure to take action to curb this uptick towards Asian Americans. And it culminated in the passing of the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act in the summer of 2021. Now, just taking a step back, those are the reasons really that the impetus of what began this paper, what we were seeing, we thought to ourselves, you know, can we look throughout history and see a pattern of this type of violence occurring from the first moments that Asian Americans started coming here during the gold rush, right, the 1800s. So the first Chinese came to the United States in the early 19th century, right around the time that the 1808 ban of the transatlantic slave trade from Africa to the New World. So, and that served as an impetus for a new cheap labor source from Asia. And that's when we see kind of this mass migration of Chinese individuals come to the United States. These individuals came through Angel Island, which is located on the West Coast in the San Francisco area of California. What I find really interesting, and it's important to note this contradiction, is the difference between Angel Island and Ellis Island, right? We hear so much about Ellis Island, the viewing of the Statue of Liberty, freedom, that kind of representation. Well, Ellis Island, as we know, was where white Europeans were allowed to enter the United States in large numbers. Almost everyone got through in Ellis Island. Angel Island, on the other hand, is where Chinese and other Asians were entering through the United States, and only about 1/8 of those individuals were allowed to come through. And even when they did come through, they were put in detention centers for a very long period of time. It's like a quarantine prior to allowing them into the country. So I thought that was a very interesting kind of contradiction there. I think what that shows is that the individuals that were shaping the United States at that time had a clear preference for white Europeans less than Asians and other brown individuals that were coming to the country. As we know, many Asian Americans had heard of the gold rush happening in the West, and they wanted to come here to make money to send back to their families in China. And this was difficult primarily due to individuals like John Bigler, the governor of California at that time. So from 1852 to about 55, Bigler put into place a statewide immigration policy. And this is one of the first of its kind, these kind of anti-Asian immigration policies. So the policies he put into place were the mining prohibition laws for Chinese, which basically only allowed Chinese to mine in areas after the white settlers had a chance to mine there first. So they could take what was left over after white settlers had a chance to kind of get in that area. In addition to that, just to kind of add insult to injury, right? They also enacted what is called the foreign miners tax. And so this was a tax on the Chinese to further reduce their profits from the gold rush, hoping that that would be an incentive for them to return to their homeland. So basically to get them out of the West, because the idea around this was that Asian Americans were stealing white settlers' jobs which is an idea that we see still prevail here today against Latinos and many other Black and brown individuals coming to the United States currently. So there was this deep-seated resentment by settlers that the Chinese were stealing their jobs. During the time in the 1860s, we also see the creation of the Central Pacific Railroad taking place and the passing of the Coolie Trade Act. The Coolie Trade Act basically forbid US citizens and residents from recruiting Chinese coolie labor, which at that time was a cheaper labor than white Europeans. But white Europeans felt that this undermined their opportunities, so were adamantly against it. During this time, because of all this resentment that is occurring during this time, we see that one of the first largest acts of violence against Chinese occur in 1871 with the Chinese massacre in Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, we see white and Latino settlers at that time brutally shot and lynched Chinese immigrants on October 24th. There were about 19 Chinese, which was about 10% of the city's Chinese population, died due to this act. It's one of the largest mass lynchings in US history. This is one of the first, as I said, this is one of the first brutal acts of violence enacted on Asian American population at that time or ever. What is interesting though about the Chinese massacre of 1871 is that we hear a lot of talk about reparations, right? And the US actually did pay reparations to China for this massacre and others in the future that occurred as well in the West Coast, because they were trying to develop this strong relationship with China at the time. So they decided that they felt embarrassed and paid them reparations for it, which I find very, very interesting, right? Because we hear so often, we're not going to do that, it's too complicated of a topic, but we have a history that the US has done this. So next slide. So here you can see the Chinese massacre of 1871, an image of that. And what's interesting about this too is that this area was actually, the area was called, it was along a main street called Calle de los Negros, which is basically street of Black people. And that is where this Chinatown existed in Los Angeles. So kind of furthers that idea of this anti-Blackness, anti-foreign ideas, right, that were occurring. Okay. Okay, in 1882, we see the Chinese Exclusion Act is passed. The Chinese Exclusion Act is basically a 10-year freeze on Chinese immigration. And then they were prohibited, if they were to leave the United States, they were prohibited from re-entering the United States. This included American-born Chinese Americans as well. And then in 1892, we see this very intentional act of the government with the Geary Act was passed. The Geary Act basically said that it required all Chinese immigrants to register themselves and carry their resident permits with them at all times. And those that were caught without these permits would be deported. So again, we see this is actually occurring with Latino communities in the United States, still in the South. It's also reminiscent of the Holocaust, having to wear a star on your shoulder, having to have papers, things like that. So it's just very interesting, this kind of xenophobia that was occurring and kind of brewing. Then at the turn of the century, we see different Asian groups begin to immigrate to the United States, like Japanese, Koreans, Hindus, and Filipinos, in addition to more Chinese. As it relates to this idea of disease, we see really the emergence of yellow peril begin to come about in 1903 with the bubonic plague outbreak in Boston. It's very interesting because it has a lot of connections to what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. So during the bubonic plague, it cemented the yellow peril stereotype. The Boston police and immigration officials, they raided Chinatown, Boston, and because they couldn't, the Chinese there couldn't produce their papers, they were either arrested or killed. In the write-up in the Boston Herald, which we looked up, they portrayed the Chinese men as a yellow men smelling of opium. So there you go, you get this kind of yellow peril idea and stigma beginning to take kind of shape. Boston then quarantined Chinese residents, which continued to give rise to this stigma of yellow peril. And here are some images that we have that were very popular during that time, kind of continuing to show that this was a kind of xenophobia that was occurring. 1900s to 1960s in the United States. During this time, Japan began sending laborers who were met with discrimination by US settlers. Migration ended due to the gentleman's agreement between US and Japan. This agreement basically said that Japan would not allow further immigration to the United States if the US government would not impose restrictions on Japanese people who are already here. And then we see kind of one of the largest moments in time that was happening against Asian Americans. In December 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And we see the xenophobia really rise and come to a point here. Roosevelt then signs an executive order forcing 120,000 plus individuals into concentration camps guarded by military on the West Coast. Anyone with 1/16 or more of Japanese blood were perceived as a threat at this time. Then in 1943, we see the Magnuson Act occur, which is also known as the Chinese Exclusion Repeal Act, and it's passed. This act basically allowed those Chinese individuals already in the country to become naturalized citizens and began Chinese immigration again to the United States since the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And now I am going to go ahead and pass this off to my colleague, Seongdeok. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Seongdeok. I am a first-year PhD student of Public Affairs at UT Dallas. Personally, I'm very happy and honored to be here to present our research. And especially, I'd like to express my gratitude to my PhD advisor, Dr. Sabharwal, for giving me this great opportunity. Here is focus on the 1960s to 2000s in the US. In 1965, the immigration nationality was enacted so it can eliminate discrimination based on race and nationality. The act abolished the quota system that was established in 1924 and restricted based on the country of origin, favored immigration from Northern and Western European countries. The act was race neutral on the face, but it is indicated that the beginning of colorblind xenophobia. Then in the late 1960s, the concept of Asian American had developed into a broad minority group that was created as a symbol of unified resistance to white racial discrimination. Next slide, please. I'd like to explain that Asians as a modern minority. The term modern minority was used by influential white people, not Asian American. Even today, non-Asian Americans often recognize Asian Americans as high achievers. However, Asian American achievements are typically dismissed as a work of exotic foreigners and nerds and social misfits. Asians continue to face resentment and violence in the US despite being classified as modern minority. And the following instance triggered a large Asian American movement for equal civil rights. In 1982, Vincent Chin, a Chinese American auto worker in Detroit, Michigan, was killed by two white men who believed Chin was Japanese, and they thought that he took away their job. However, neither man were convicted. This incident was a similar outcome to Chinese massacre, so no one was held accountable. Next slide, please. This slide focuses on the 2000s to present in the US. In 2000s, on May 12, President Bill Clinton signed the American Competitiveness in the 21st Century Act into law. This act increased the annual number of skilled foreign workers who could enter the US by more than 85%. However, despite these developments in 2001, there is a 9/11 attack, terrorist attack on the World Trade Center, and Pentagon marked a new phase in US immigration policy. And then hate and avoidance and discrimination against Asian American in the US have worsened since the 2002 and 2004 outbreak of SARS. Also, in 2016, Donald Trump won the US presidential election in part by inducing fear of immigrant among his constituents, and his anti-immigrant worldview and extremist policies continue to appear in the news and other sources. So it is forcing many Americans to recognize the continuing relevance of xenophobia in the US. Then the primary origination theory for COVID-19 traces is beginning to Wuhan, China in late 2019. From there, the virus quickly spread around the world. So also President Trump referred to COVID-19 as a Chinese or Kung Flu virus multiple times in the early days of the pandemic in the US. So these factors provoked an increase in hate crimes and violence against Asian Americans throughout the 2020 and 2021. Next slide, please. And xenophobia targeting Asian Americans continue to American society as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. In March 2021, a single gunman killed 8 Asian Americans and injured 6 others at a massage shop in Atlanta. Also, the sub-AAPI Hate Reporting Center reported an increase in Asian hate crimes. The majority of the hate incidents reflect anti-China or anti-immigrant sentiments. To address this heinous hate crime experienced by Asian Americans, on May 18, 2021, the United States House of Representatives approved the COVID-19 Hate Crime Act. Next slide, please. And this part is a discussion and conclusion. So I want to talk about some important discussion and future study directions. Asian Americans in the US have been subject to racist troops and xenophobic attack and widespread hate crimes. The xenophobia and racism experienced by this group are not new, as demonstrated historically in this study. So by examining xenophobia through the lens of othering framework, we begin to understand how dominant group marginalize non-dominant group. So we think that future study in PA and policy must address the challenges and experiences of realization faced by these individuals groups of Asians, because the aim of diversity and social equity and inclusion cannot be realized unless we uproot racism and oppression from all aspects of individual and organizational and societal norm, policy and practice. So to combat the deep-rooted systematic racism in this nation, we must use, educate, and empower and mobilize the people around us to force change. So until now, the field of PA has paid limited attention to the historical aspect of racism. So examining original documents is one way to understand the historical roots of racist attitudes from yellow peril to the current COVID-19 pandemic. This is because Asians continuously face pervasive discrimination. So thank you so much for listening for our presentation.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. Next, I'd like to turn it over again to Dr. Anjerrika from Howard University as our discussant, and then we'll attend to some of the questions if we have any in chat here. And please, audience, feel free to post any questions that you might have in the chat.
Hi, everybody. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Like, Dr. Wyatt-Nichol said, I am Dr. Anjerrika Bean, and I'm discussing for the panel today. And so I'm not going to take up much of your time, but I do want to kind of just re-emphasize a few things before I even get started with that. I kind of wanted to start with just something that I looked up today that I wanted to share with you. In 2019, the Judiciary Committee held a hearing to examine what they consider to be an urgent crisis in our country. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about the rise of hate crimes and white nationalism, issues relating to hate crimes, and the issue of white nationalism. They argued that the topic goes to the heart of our country. Longstanding struggle to carry out the preamble to our Constitution that says, and that it was what it says and what it was designed to do. And that is for us to form a more perfect union. That is the goal of our country. So with the increase of white nationalism, our country, of course, has had an increase on hate crimes and violence. So I know a lot of the things that we've talked about, or the panelists have talked about in this discussion, have had to do with the historical oppression of really people of color. So we've talked about Asians, we've talked about Blacks, we've talked about the Latino community, we've talked about all of these people and how this has historically been a problem. But in 2021, the FBI reported hate crimes was at its highest levels in 12 years. The FBI reported that of 15,136 law enforcement agencies that submitted reports, 7,759 of those criminal incidents were motivated by biases toward race, ethnicity, ancestry, religion, sexual orientation, disability, gender, and gender identity. Majority of the race-based hate crimes that have happened, they have happened against African Americans, Black people, with the percentage being as high as 56% of the race-based crimes happening because of anti-Blackness. But just like the panelists said, these numbers not only against Black people, they are also against people of color, and the people that were following after African Americans were the Asian community. And so that was an FBI report that was done in 2021. So this is recent. And we all know that even with the insurgents, we can think about how whiteness, white power, white nationalism have contributed to what we've seen at the Capitol as it relates to the insurgents and the race, how race played a role in that, and how it is increasing the rhetoric that we have increased the rhetoric that racism has increased with rhetoric. And it's not just rhetoric, it has real implications, and real people are actually getting hurt. And that is something that we need to pay attention to. So in terms of what the panelists spoke about, there was a couple of themes that I was able to pull out. Number one, like I talked about, there is a historical aspect of the otherness of people. I think the soon-to-be Dr. Seongdeok, I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong, talked about the othering of people. Dr. Wyatt started with knowledge being under attack. She talked about CRT. Ms. Cooper also talked about demonizing any information that's other than white. So the misunderstanding of CRT and how it's been applied, and it's not just theory anymore. It's not just part of that ivory tower aspect of what's going on. There are real implications, and the real implications include the banning of CRT from many different states and from many different countries, and how a lot of people, white and Black, but specifically I want to talk about white people in this conversation, they want to divorce themselves from the historical facts of race and how problematic that can be. And then we talked about how it's, like I said, it's not just theory anymore, how this actually plays out, how it has played out historically with the killing of people, marginalizing people, not allowing people to have access to different places that they can work. Like the mining aspect that was brought up in terms of the Asian community not being able, they basically having to take the leftovers after the white people have mined. So we can go back to that, but it also has very prevalent implications that are happening right now and have happened historically in marginalized community. Ms. Robinson brought that up when she talked about anti-racism and health disparities, and how, specifically I'm here in Baltimore as well, the work what's happening in Baltimore with health disparities, and that it's not just Black people not having access, or white people, any marginalized group, not having equal access to care like their white counterparts, but it also has to do with the fact that the government is responsible for, handling different pesticide issues in the country. I mean, specifically in certain cities, and they're not happening. That's not happening for particular communities, which is also contributing to this, these racial issues and these healthcare disparities that we're having in the country. And not only in our country, but also in our cities and in our states. And then, I wanted to bring up, lastly, but not, but very important, is the idea of xenophobia that was also attached to the othering framing of anything other than white, right? So we talked about the real current things of oppression. And then if you're not white and you don't meet the white standard, then you have to deal with other things that come out from politicians, that come out from some people that have been elected as leaders, and some things that we have seen that have reoccurred today with the naming particular groups a certain way. So, the Kung flu was brought up, the Wuhan virus was brought up to be attached to different Asian communities, and how there's still situations and issues that we have to deal with today. But in order for us to work towards a more perfect union, we have to decide, and we have to continue to put the pressure on our political leaders and our policy leaders in order for us to be able to fight against the oppressive structures that are here. Another thing that was brought up when I'm talking about structures was structural racism, the idea of race being a structural construct. And so all of those things are things that we're actively working at. And we know that in COVID, recently, we've had some progress with the COVID-19 hate crime bill being passed, and some other things that have been passed as well. So I just want to thank the panelists for all of the insight that they gave us, but I don't want to leave without leaving y'all with an incredible quote that I think kind of helps us think about this historical oppression, but why it's important even for today. And I'm going to leave you with a quote that's from James Baldwin. Ooh, give me 1 second. Okay. James Baldwin said, as it relates to history, because that's what we're fighting. We don't want to look at something like it's in the past, that's slavery, that's xenophobia. We're not there anymore. This whole colorblind racism thing, like that's not something we're dealing with. No, we're dealing with it. So let's see what James Baldwin had to say about it. He said, history is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history. If we pretend otherwise, we are literally criminals. I attest to this. The world is not white. It was never white. It cannot be white. White is a metaphor for power. And in this, he wrote, and that is simply a way of describing a Chase Manhattan Bank, but he's talking about it being a power thing. But we must not live our lives like that no more. We must continue to push on, and we must understand that our history is now, and the time is always now. So that's all that I have.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful discussion there. And one of the things, I'll just add a couple of, there was a nice in the chat book that was posted here, and I'll have to check for some questions that are coming up. And I encourage everyone, if I don't see your hand, just post your question in the chat. There's another book I'd also like to mention. One is Kyle Fambry's old book, Dr. Kyle K-Y-L-E Fambry. I want to say F-A-R-M-B-R-Y. I could be spelling it wrong. It's been a minute. Anyway, Dr. Fambry had written a wonderful book on public administration and the othering and the other. And it was perfect, and it fits right into the broader narrative and conversations here. There's another that I have, and this is by, it's Anthea Butler. I don't have the skills yet with my fingertips to throw it in the chat. I'm working on two different pieces here, actually, two devices. But anyway, this is called White Evangelical Racism, and I highly recommend it because it really captures a bit of what's been happening recently. With that, I want to thank everyone and open it up to questions. So let's see. checking, I'm checking. No questions from the audience. I see some of you, I know you. Dr. Meghna Sabharwal.
I just posted that link of the book you sent, or you mentioned, Heather. That was great. I didn't get the second name, so if you tell me, I'm happy to search and post that link as well.
Yes, the second name, let me pull it up here, is Anthea Butler, Anthea Butler. And this is white evangelical racism.
Very good. Okay, I got that. There is a question I see in the chat. How do you reframe model minority? I think that's a great question. Firstly, I would say to even put Asians in a monolith group, right? Asia, if you all know, is 60% of the world population. 48 countries make Asia. And now you're making it as Asian American as a big monolith. That in itself, I think, does disservice to so many groups and people who have been oppressed. Of course, we do talk about the Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Asian, Indians, but they are the Filipinos, there are people from Bhutan, Laos, and there's so many people from different regions, Burma, that they are faced with a lot of challenges. So I think, this whole idea of model minority was actually more of a political idea, to almost pit one group against the other and say, hey, look at this group, they pulled themselves up with the socks and were able to do this. There was a Time magazine article, I believe, Aurora, back in the 60s that had a front page image of a Asian, she's probably Chinese Asian mother, and her 3 sons, two are doctors now, and one was working in the US Army. And it was more of kind of putting these groups against each other, which I think never works. And politicians always do that. They use political rhetoric. They'll use one group against the other to their advantage. And as such, I think this whole notion of model minority should be just gone, because it's a stereotype, and whether it's a positive stereotype, it hurts. So there is no positive or a negative stereotype, as we know. So any stereotype can have unintended consequences. So in that sense, I feel like, that disadvantages the very group it was supposed to help. And there's been a backlash certainly on this. So we need to get away with that term. And again, it's not as easy as that, but I'm not sure if I answered your question, or even if I have an answer for your question, but that's a very good question. Thank you.
Catherine, do you have your hand raised? Feel free to go ahead and ask your question.
I do. As a historian, I'm really happy to be at this particular panel and hear the discussion of history, and also especially appreciate James Baldwin's reminder that history is us always, and we are just an embodiment. We're just flesh and bones around history. And so I've got some suggestions about the way that we can use history because a lot of what you've all been talking about has been terminology and labeling and words. And we all know words are extremely powerful. And most people by now have transitioned from using the word slave to using enslaved people. We see this very common, very important shift, and we need to keep using that. And we need to start to talk about, as you know, we talk about enslavement, not the slave trade, but rather the industry, the human trafficking industry. These are very important words because they help educate the people around us, even the good people around us need reminding, because we grew up with words that help us feel better and whitewash our life. And one reminder, I've recently gotten from Peter Wood is a historian at Duke, and he wrote some very important work. And he gave me another one recently, which I'd like to share with you, which is that we sometimes use this word plantation. And we even see this word, on townhomes and restaurants. And this is a whitewashing word. And he uses instead, and I highly recommend, and I've been using, slave labor camp. And it's a really good reminder, like, no, don't stop, stop. This is a slave labor camp, and it's really hard for Americans to accept that that's what we have had. And so I highly recommend, it doesn't come off the tongue as well as plantation, but slave labor camp. And it really helps when you say things like, Samuel Ogle, who's the street, the school down the street was named after. He was the owner of some slave labor camps in this area. This area where my house is built used to be slave labor camps. This is very, very, jarring and helpful to people when you're trying to educate them around you. Just as a part of, I think words matter, and we've got to really use them to help us all grow. So just a recommendation.
I think that's an excellent point. Excellent point. And maybe we have time for one more question, but I just saw something come up saying we're going to be kicked out of the room automatically. So I don't know. So we can keep on until we get kicked out. I don't know. But it's very important. It reminds me too, they still have areas that they'll call Williamsburg Plantation.
Oh yeah,
for
people are really into it. People will buy a house in something called, Plantation Acres.
So.
Yeah, it's insane. Or Soup Plantation is the name of a restaurant in California.
Oh. Well, another thing,
like the commercial.
So thank you and the entire team for this fantastic